Life on board a ship during the Age of Sail is often romanticized as one of freedom, exploration, and swashbuckling adventure. The story of an independent, spirited man leaving behind the mundane drudgery of normal life to embark upon voyages to exotic and undiscovered locations. The exploits of such men forever enshrined within legend and folklore. However, the reality of life at sea couldn't have been more different. The world the sailors inhabited one of hardship, danger, and poverty. Their days spent toiling under primitive and unbearable conditions, where discomfort was the norm and disease ran rampant. These prisoners on board the floating jail, cut off from the world for months and even years at a time, their grim lives almost guaranteed to be cut disturbingly short by the perils they faced on a daily basis. The Age of Sail lasted between the mid-16th and mid-19th centuries, a period characterized by exploration, colonization, the development of international trade, and the establishment of globe-spanning empires. This 300-year-long golden maritime age would see millions of men leave behind their homes in search of better prospects across the waves, abandoning desperate lives of poverty and a bleak future for what they hoped would be more promising horizons. However, most of these hopeful dreamers were painfully unaware of the terrible fate that awaited them on the high seas. Once on board the ship that would be their home for the months and years ahead, the new sailors were allocated work that was both physically demanding and extremely dangerous, with men frequently killed or horribly maimed, handling heavy cargo or working high up on the sails. In a time when the health and safety of employees was a low priority, the ship itself was a giant floating hazard, the network of heavy ropes and chains hanging precariously overhead, liable to fall and crush anyone unlucky enough to be working underneath. Rough weather and raging storms compounded the already existing dangers, the sailors tasked with climbing the mast to furl the sails in pitch darkness with fingers numb from cold, at great risk of plummeting to their deaths below, while plunging into the churning, ice-cold seas promised an equally certain death, the victim sure to drown before anyone could rescue him. That's if any effort to save him was even made in the first place, his shipmates sensibly hesitant to risk their own necks in such treacherous conditions. A life could be snatched away at a moment's notice by a rogue wave sweeping a man overboard, or a frayed and weathered rope snapping under load, and few sailors would reach old age without a myriad of injuries and a patchwork of scars covering their body. That's if they were lucky enough to survive that long. Whether hammered by winter storms or the scorching summer sun, the men spent much of their time in extreme discomfort, their clothes perpetually wet from rain, sea spray, or high humidity, their energy sapped by the extremities the open sea assailed them with. The weather was both a sailor's cruelest enemy and his most benevolent ally. The power of the winds, the very fuel and force which carried sail ships safely to their destination, but also one which could be the deliverer of its doom. A single storm capable of erasing a ship and her crew from existence in a split second, constantly threatening to hurl the ship upon the razor-sharp rocks of some remote, faraway island, or splinter its thick oak hull into 1,000 pieces, sending it and everyone on board crashing to the bottom of the deep sea. Even those lucky enough to survive the sinking of a ship faced a slow and lingering death from dehydration and starvation. Desperately adrift upon whatever floating raft they could assemble, with virtually no chance of rescue, the eyes of their fellow castaways hungrily scrutinized the stranded crew in search of a potential meal, the so-called custom of the sea dictating that in such dire circumstances, the flesh of another was fair game, his sacrifice providing much-needed nourishment that could save the others, with such cases proving to be disturbingly common. The maddening hunger and thirst of a man who hasn't eaten for weeks, driving him to plunge the depths of immorality in his quest for survival. The sickening thought of ending up as a meal for your former friends, no doubt weighing heavily upon a sailor's mind. Yet it wasn't just the raging ferocity of the sea that tormented the men sailing upon it. Equally perilous was its potential for quiet calm, what was known as the doldrums robbing the ship of the very force that powered it along. With no wind to fill the sails and propel the ship, Days and even weeks could pass with the ship making little progress on its journey, the sailors aboard languishing under the inescapable burning sun with nowhere to hide and with no shade to shelter in, the fear and frustration at the predicament soon giving way to desperation and despair. Any amount of time spent trapped in such eerily calm weather could spell doom for an entire voyage, the men's water and food rapidly diminishing with each day of minimal progress, the captain often left with no other choice but to drastically cut the crew's rations in a last-ditch effort to stave off disaster. As thirst and malnutrition took hold, opportunistic diseases spread with ease, and the crew grew weaker physically and psychologically with each passing day. The doldrums would plague some of history's most famous voyages, with Ferdinand Magellan's circumnavigation of the globe in 1519 enduring 20 days of calm weather, which saw him log a mere 9 nautical miles of movement, while Walter Raleigh's 1617 expedition to Venezuela in search of El Dorado was hit by an incredible 40 days of doldrums, causing huge numbers of the crew to die from dehydration and disease, and almost resulting in an outright mutiny. And it wasn't unheard of for ships to spend more than a month stranded on an ocean surface that resembled glass more than water. Yet Mother Nature wasn't the only predator lurking far out at sea, and pirates or enemy ships during wartime provided an equally deadly, ever-present threat, the clashes fought usually descending into brutal hand-to-hand combat with boarding parties, as a captured ship was far more valuable than a sunken one. Reports of ships lost at sea or seized by rampaging pirates would have no doubt placed a heavy burden on the psychological health of sailors, the constant mental stress and fear of the many perils that awaited them, feeding into an abnormally high prevalence of superstition amongst the men, as all number of strange practices and customs took hold as a way of warding off bad luck. Yet if the risky work, dangerous weather and cutthroat pirates did not claim the life of a sailor, illness often would. A sail ship was a breeding ground for all manner of rats, insects, and other vermin that spread a variety of debilitating and often deadly infectious diseases, including dysentery, typhus, and malaria. Eliminating these unwanted passengers was all but impossible, the rats and mice covertly boarding docked ships en masse, while more exotic wildlife would often be inadvertently brought back to the ship by crew members foraging ashore for wood to use as fuel. These vital supplies also home to scorpions, spiders, and even snakes. This newly arrived wildlife quickly spreading throughout the ship's many crevices and dark hiding places, and imposing a reign of terror on the unfortunate crew, biting, stinging, and tormenting the sailors as they try to sleep in their hammocks or go about their day. Cockroaches infested every corner of the ship, while lice became simply a reality of everyday life, the sailors seemingly permanently at war with them, their unending effort to combat the blood-sucking insects, explaining why so many combs are found at shipwreck sites. Smallpox, typhus, typhoid, and pneumonia claimed untold numbers of lives, the terrible squalor the men existed in turning the ships into floating petri dishes that supercharged the spread and power of disease and general illness. Suffocatingly overcrowded living conditions saw hundreds of men cramped into dark, damp, and dirty communal quarters deep below deck, the subterranean slums shut off from the fresh air of the sea so as to prevent seawater seeping into the ship's bowels. The stifling atmosphere below, tainted by the nauseating smells that hundreds of filthy, unhealthy, and constantly sweating men produce when cooped up together for months at a time. This foul, overpowering stench, combined with polluted water, poor hygiene, rampaging vermin, and constant close contact with the sick, allowed illness and death to flourish. The opportunistic and often exotic diseases encountered in the tropics and other far-flung corners of the planet, finding easy prey in the now weakened and vulnerable sailors, as it spread through entire crews like wildfire, with the vast majority of sailors likely to fall seriously ill at some point in their career. In a time before modern medicine, simple injuries including cuts and broken bones could be lethal, with amputation a favoured treatment for many wounds. As the surgeons were working in primitive, unsanitary conditions, infection and gangrene were common, and any type of medical treatment could prove fatal, no matter how minor the initial wound might have been. Such serious health risks were compounded by the terrible diet sailors existed on for months at a time, the meager intake of poor quality food, weakening immune systems and leaving the crew prone to any and all pathogens they might encounter. The main foods on offer were those that could be somewhat reliably preserved for the duration of a long voyage, with dried and salted meats, fish, cheese, and ale the staple food source. However, even these items would deteriorate over time. The lack of ventilation and drainage, and constant damp and humidity, eventually causing everything to spoil and rot, while rats and other vermin gnawed into any foods they could find, spreading even more disease and illness. Within days of departure, anything fresh had either been consumed or spoiled, and even the water supply would stagnate and become foul, virtually poisoning whoever was brave enough to drink it. In fact, the water quality was so poor that sailors would often drink alcohol instead, in an effort to ward off sickness. With supplies running low, the men would be forced to consume the dreaded sea biscuit in larger quantities. These dry, rock-hard, teeth-breaking crackers, able to stay fresh for months and even years at a time. However, even this last resort of sustenance was barely edible, the starving sailors soon learning to bang the brick-like biscuit on a hard surface before eating, so as to shake out as many of the maggots and weevils infesting it as possible. Fed such a poor quality and highly processed diet, the crew was rendered dangerously vulnerable to the most feared killer of all, a disease so prolific that it's thought to have claimed the lives of more sailors than anything else. Throughout the age of sail, more than 2 million sailors are estimated to have died from scurvy, a disease so prevalent and potent that ship owners planned for a death rate of 50% during long-distance voyages. Caused by a lack of vitamin C in the diet, the first symptom manifested as extreme lethargy, a warning sign often mistaken by a ship's captain as pure laziness, leading to ill and dying men being wrongly punished for abandoning their duties. Soon after, the gums would take on a spongy appearance, the teeth would loosen and fall out, and the afflicted would begin to experience terrifying hallucinations before internal bleeding eventually finished them off. Such was the fear of falling victim to this mysterious killer that many sailors were drawn to superstitious techniques for staving off death, believing that earth and dry land could cure the sick, resulting in those struck down being covered in dirt by their friends in a last-ditch attempt to heal them. However, despite all of these terrible fates a sailor could meet at sea, it would be the men who shared his floating prison who could truly make a sailor's life miserable. Strict discipline was considered the only way to ensure a smooth voyage, warding off mutiny and protecting the ship's valuable cargo. A captain essentially assumed the role of a tyrannical king, holding the power of life and death over his crew, and although a sailor's terms of employment were clearly documented in a written contract that stipulated the pay, the rules and regulations, nature and length of the voyage, and punishments due for any infractions of the rules, once at sea, many of the more sadistic captains took pleasure in wielding their immense power, handing out unjust and unnaturally cruel punishments for even minor breaches of the rules, turning the ship into a torture chamber capable of making a sailor's life hell. Those who violated these rules, or simply found themselves disliked by the captain or his officers, could be mercilessly flogged with a vicious instrument known as a cat-o'-nine-tails, a device that was essentially a heavy whip with 9 knotted cords at the end, leaving the flesh on his back horrifically lacerated, the pain from these terrible wounds further amplified as they were coated with salt to prevent infection. Others might find themselves humiliated in front of the rest of the crew by being stripped naked, covered in tar, and then coated with feathers, or punished by being forced to climb the mast where they sat for hours exposed to the harsh and ice-cold wind, while more severe crimes were met with hangings or keel-hauling, the act of throwing a sailor overboard and using an attached rope to drag him underneath the ship, his body torn to shreds by the barnacles attached to the ship's hull, while often drowning in the process. Away from civilization for months at a time, the men did what they could to make the best of their hard lives, spending their free time playing musical instruments, gambling, or sharing stories with their friends. However, despite such attempts at entertaining themselves, boredom inevitably set in, leading to feuds and fights frequently breaking out between the frustrated, irritated crew. These disagreements often lethal, with the ship populated by hard-drinking, rough men who would have likely not been the kind to take insults and slights lightly. Although their jobs were both highly dangerous and unforgivingly backbreaking, the compensation the average sailor received was relatively meagre, what little they could save soon blown on women and booze on their first trip ashore, the men tending to live for the moment as a way of coping with their harsh existence. Unsurprisingly, faced with such dangers and intolerable conditions, few men voluntarily chose a sailor's life, with many of those who did deserting as soon as possible, the problem becoming so bad that navies and merchant fleets lacked the necessary manpower to function. To combat this shortage, groups of men known as press gangs forcibly recruited anyone they could find in ports and cities across the country, patrolling the streets and taverns, and using their clubs and fists to coerce the unwilling into a new career at sea, these acts of impressment even authorized by the English Parliament. Other strategies included plying men with alcohol before getting them to drunkenly sign a contract, or simply deceiving them about their terms of service, hiding the harsh reality of the new life that awaited them. The practice was so common that it's estimated that as much as half of a ship's crew was comprised of pressed men, with these disturbing recruitment tactics continuing to be utilized as recently as 1850, when improving technology and conditions made the prospect of a life at sea at least somewhat bearable. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you again soon.